So if you are working with the recipe that was emailed ahead of time, that's everything I have measured out. However, if you did receive a kit prior to this class that has the ingredients, your ingredients are just slightly different. You have freeze-dried strawberries versus the fresh strawberries, and I'll walk you through what to use in place of the fresh strawberries. So how much to use, so on and so forth. So I'll make sure to give you those cues as we go along. And if you also did receive that kit, you're going to want to soak 1 cup of the cashews that was sent to you in water, just so that you can have those pre-soaking. I have my corn husks pre-soaking. So just so that as we do the other things, like those elements are working in the background, just kind of sitting there soaking, getting ready for when we need them. All right, so let's get into the recipe itself. Thank you so much again for joining. I'm all decked out in my pink today because we're doing lovely pink tamales, and it's El Día del Amor y Amistad tomorrow, Valentine's Day. So thank you so much for sharing this space with me. My name is Jocelyn Ramirez. I'm the chef and founder of Todo Verde here in Los Angeles. And I started it because I wanted to be able to create dishes like the one that we're making today, where, you know, many of us grew up eating sweet tamales, and they're so delicious, they're so comforting. It's more than just, you know, a little sweet treat. It's almost something that is also filling and nurturing. And these strawberry rose tamales are inspired by our Amorcito, which is a strawberry rose, chia, and maple syrup agua fresca that we have been making for a long time, and it has just become at the forefront of what we offer. People are always like, oh, the Amorcito. If we show up to an event without the Amorcito, people will be angry at us. So we have now started making, I mean, I've translated that recipe to be tamales, to be a milk tea, to a cake, and so on and so forth, because the flavors of strawberry and rose are undeniably delicious. So I hope you enjoy this recipe. We will get into it right now. So first things first, again, if you have not soaked your corn husks, you want to get those soaking. And all I did, I'm just going to show you, is I just got hot tap water. I started soaking these this morning. You always could soak them overnight if you wanted to. So just soak them in hot, I did hot water since I only started soaking them maybe about an hour ago. And then you want to put something heavy on them to weigh them down. This bowl, I could have had a bigger pot to soak them in just to make sure it's all submerged, but every once in a while I'll come by and I'll kind of move things around and then resubmerge. I'll put some water in the bowl and just resubmerge. So you want to make sure as much of it is in the water. You can move them around if you need to. Again, this is like now kind of warm water. It's not as hot as it was at the beginning, but it makes your hojas more pliable, easy to work with. And then we'll end up draining this liquid out and giving them a few rinses. Especially sometimes the hojas have a little bit of like they use almost like an acidic ingredient to preserve them so that they don't spoil. But you don't want that flavor in your tamales. So you definitely want to give them a good rinse just to remove as much of that preservative that is in the hojas. So I'm just going to set this aside. I just wanted to show you how I do soak them. And then we're going to get into the other ingredients. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ingredients, and then we'll go ahead and start combining them together. But I like to just give a little bit of preface of why I use these particular ingredients, what the purpose of them are, and then we'll start kind of combining all of them together. So of course, first things first, masa harina is super important for any tamal dish. And I think that a lot of us in the Latino community tend to lean on Maseca as the brand that's readily available. Maybe our families have been using it for a long time. And I'm here to tell you, please don't use Maseca. Please consider using a brand. Like today, I'm using Bob's Red Mill. I have Macienda, I have Gold Mine, I have several other, I just have the Macienda bag here. I have, this is Macienda, which is a white corn version of masa harina, whereas a Bob's Red Mill is a yellow corn or golden corn. And they are both are different, obviously, aside from the fact that they're different corn, white corn, yellow corn. But the Bob's Red Mill is definitely a little bit more coarse. It feels a little bit more grainy, where the Macienda is definitely more of a fine grind, typically used more for tortillas, which is why it's so fine. And so you'll end up with a more loose masa harina if you were to use this particular brand. I also do have gold mine, but the most important thing that I want you all to kind of take away from this is that any masa harina that you purchase should only have 2 ingredients. It should literally be just corn and hydrated lime, trace of lime, something of that nature. 2 ingredients: corn, trace of lime, or something like that. And it's essentially the trace of lime or the hydrated lime is the limestone or the cal that is used to nixtamalize the corn to make it masa harina. So another big question that I get is, can I use cornmeal? I have cornmeal in my cupboard. Can I use cornmeal instead of masa harina? The answer is no if you want to have a traditional tamal, because masa harina has gone through that nixtamal process, which has sort of the acidity of that limestone has been soaked with the corn for several hours, usually overnight, and it removes the outer layer of that corn that many folks say yields a more nutritious, easier to digest end product, which is your tamal, your tortilla, so on and so forth. So I definitely wanted to talk about masa harina. And then, of course, we are using, the other things are familiar, like sugar, baking powder. They're mostly familiar, right? But we are using, for example, coconut oil and vegan butter as sort of our lard replacement. Now, I will say, if you didn't have the vegan butter or the vegan coconut oil, you will still be able to make this recipe adding a bit more water, because tamales traditionally, prior to colonization, did not have oil or fat in them. They were typically more water, with not water always, but some sort of a broth, whatever people were kind of stewing. So some sort of liquid flavoring, and the masa harina, it didn't always have fat. So I imagine back then the tamales were maybe a bit more dry and crumbly versus soft and moist. And so the texture has definitely changed, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to be delicious, right? So for the coconut oil, really important here is that it has to be refined coconut oil. So if you're new to using coconut oil to your plant-based dishes, if you were to use virgin coconut oil, your tamales are going to taste like coconut. Now, that might be okay for this recipe because it's going to taste like coconut, strawberry, and rose, but if you were making savory, you definitely don't want the flavor of coconut to come through at all. So refined is super essential to many of the dishes that I use. In fact, I don't use any virgin coconut oil. I just don't buy it. I only buy refined, which essentially strips away the flavor of the coconut. And the other cool thing about coconut oil, aside from this recipe, because for this recipe, this is going to kind of act like our fatty lard substitute, or shortening, for example. But for other recipes, like if you were to use coconut oil, as you can see, like right now it's softened because it's been out, but it melts really nicely too. But if you pop it in the fridge, it's going to get hard. It's like a butter, right? That gets hard. It's a saturated fat. So if you're making a cheese, for example, and then you end up popping it in the fridge, the fact that there's coconut oil in there is going to help it settle and kind of become a solid shape. So it's also kind of essential in a lot of recipes because of that nature of it's meltable, but then it also, when it gets chilled, it gets solid. And so that's really essential to a lot of dishes too. So just a side note about that for other recipes. And then of course, vegan butter. If you have this available to you, I like to use Miyoko's. I've also made this recipe with Earth Balance, all really great vegan butters. And this is just another fat element that's a little bit more creamy. So when it's melted, it's a little bit more creamy than the coconut oil, but again, super not essential. So if you don't have it handy, you can definitely get by with just the coconut oil. And the recipe calls for somewhere between a half a cup to quarter cup, and a half a cup to 3/4 of a cup. And I would say that if you don't have the vegan butter, maybe lean a little bit closer to the 3/4 of a cup, and you should be totally fine with just the coconut oil. So just wanted to give that little heads up about these particular ingredients before we get everything kind of in the flow of getting everything kind of cooking. Because then I get going, and I want to make sure that I give you enough context of kind of why these ingredients. And the other thing that I will talk about briefly, I mean, you can't see it, it's a clear liquid, but this is our rose water. This is just a tablespoon. As you can see, a little bit goes a long way. If you smell it, it's super fragrant, super aromatic, and it's almost like a perfume. So if you add too much of it to your dish, it's gonna overpower it, and it's gonna taste a little bit soapy. So the 1 tablespoon is just what you need. If you really like the flavor, you can add a little dash more, but I wouldn't recommend adding like a 2nd tablespoon. That would be overkill at that point. So it's just enough where you taste like the balance of the flavor with the strawberry and the rose, not enough where it's like, whoa, there's roses in here. It tastes so weird. It should be like a delicate, the way that we see roses, right? Like a delicate flower. It should be this delicate flavor in the dish. All right. So let's start getting into it. If you are using either the fresh strawberries or the freeze-dried strawberries, we're going to start with the strawberries and the almond milk first. And we're just going to blend it and have that solution ready for us. So if you're using the fresh strawberries, you are going to use 2 cups. I just quartered mine so that they fit into my cup measurement really well. So I'm using 2 cups of fresh strawberries. If you're using freeze-dried strawberries, use 1 heaping cup. So here's 1 cup, just a little bit, kind of a bunch of, not a bunch, but I would say just like a little mountain of strawberries over the cup measurement, just because you can't really like crush down all the strawberries because they're hard and you'll make a mess. So if you just do 1 heaping cup, you should be at about the right measurement. And the thing with the freeze-dried strawberries is if you also smell those, the flavor and the scent of strawberries is so strong. These are strawberries that have been cut and at their peak, like they're very sweet. They're like really delicious strawberries at the peak of their ripeness. And so you don't need as much as the 2 cups to make this dish. 1 heaping cup should be enough. If you wanted to add more, however, please feel free to do so. You likely have more in that package, so you can absolutely add more if you wanted even more of that strawberry kick in there. So that's one where, like, if you wanted to add more, go ahead, but the rose is the one where I would be hesitant to add more. And so what you're going to do is you're going to add your strawberries, either the freeze dried or the fresh, to a blender. And then for the almond milk, if you are using fresh strawberries, you're going to use just 1 cup of almond milk. But if you're using the freeze dried strawberries, you're going to do 2 cups. And the reason you're doubling up your almond milk is because the freeze dried strawberries obviously don't have any moisture compared to all the moisture that these fresh ones have. So you need to introduce more moisture into that solution to get the kind of the right consistency of that liquid that you're creating. So it's going to be kind of like a strawberry milk. It's going to be runnier than a smoothie. It'll be a little bit chunky, but that's what you're yielding. Do I have a question?
Yeah, would you say that fresh strawberries or freeze-dried strawberries are better for this recipe? Is one better than the other?
I mean, honestly, I've had them both ways and they're both really good. So I wouldn't say one is necessarily better. I mean, the freeze-dried strawberries, like sometimes you buy strawberries, right? And they're, what's the word for the sabridos? They are not sweet. Like they're strawberries. They look like strawberries, but the flavor isn't quite there. Yeah, sometimes they're sour, totally. And then these freeze-dried strawberries are like, wow, super delicious. The most delicious strawberries you've probably ever had. And so your strawberry flavor is going to be more amplified and more delicious with the freeze-dried rather than the fresh ones. If you're fresh ones, like the ones I have here, I picked them up at the store yesterday. And I was like, oh, these don't look that great, but I'm not gonna, you know, drive around to like 5 different stores looking for the best strawberries. I always recommend if you can get them from the farmer's market, that's the best option. Farmer's market strawberries are, especially when they're in season, are always super sweet, super delicious because they get to ripen on the plant essentially, and they're picked closer to, so they might be like just ripening and just right, and then they're picked at that point and brought to the area that the farmers markets are, rather than commercial strawberries, which might be picked when they're really green and they ripen and transport at the grocery store, like in the back, you know, until they're put out on the shelf. So it makes a big difference. All right, so I am going to blend my mixture again. I'm using the fresh, so it's 2 cups strawberries, 1 cup milk. If you're using freeze dried, it's 1 heaping cup freeze dried, 2 cups milk. And you're just gonna blend and get this to just become this nice, smooth mixture. All right. The other thing I will say about this too, about the strawberries and the milk, is I just like to leave things out at room temperature. Like the strawberries and the milk have been out of the fridge for at least an hour because I did measure everything out. And it just helps me as I'm mixing the masa harina together, because like I said, the coconut oil and the butter, when they touch cold, they get hard, right? They tense up, they get solid. And if my mixture is really cold, like just out of the fridge, it's going to create little chunks of coconut oil and butter throughout. And those will melt in the cooking process when the tamales are being steamed. But I just prefer to get my batter, my masa harina, as smooth as possible so that I feel like everything's really well incorporated. So that's just like an additional tip. If you didn't do that, it's totally fine. But I just prefer to do that. So this mixture, I'm just gonna set it aside for now. I know that my strawberry mixture is ready for me. And then we're going to pour in our masa harina. So the reason I waited to measure this out when we're here together is because I just like to quickly show, you know, a lot of people tend to measure out their masa harina doing this. Like they'll open the package and they'll stick the cup in and they're like trying to fill the measuring cup. And then when they bring it out, it's like really jam packed with masa harina. And what you end up doing is because you're kind of pressing it down, trying to fill it in the pouch, you don't end up with like a fluffy cup. You end up with a really packed cup. And you end up with more than 1 cup actually, because you're smashing it in there. So you want just 1 fluffy cup. I usually like to just pour. So I put my measuring receptacle into my bowl and I just measure. We're gonna end up doing 3 cups here. And so now this is like a nice fluffy 1 cup. Let me add a little bit more. There we go. And then I go on to the next one and keep measuring this way versus bringing my cup measurement into the bag itself. Let's see, that looks fine. And then one thing you can do if you had a really big bag is you can always use a spoon, you know? You can use a spoon to scoop out just what you need from the container, the larger container, and into your measuring cup. And so this is typically why when people do that, when they stick the cup measurement into the container, that's typically why they end up with like really dry, a drier cake, cookies, tamales, whatever it may be.
And Jocelyn, would you recommend sifting it also, or is that overkill?
I don't think you need to sift the masa harina. It's very rare that it has clumps in it. One thing you could do is you can use a whisk. Like mine, I don't see any clumps in it, so I don't see any like sticking that's happening, but you obviously could grab a whisk. There we go. And just give it a little whisk and make sure everything looks good, that there's no big chunks that you're seeing, but typically I don't see that in the masa harina, unless perhaps it's really old. but if you have fresh, it should be fine. Okay, so I am going to add in my other dry ingredients. I have here, and I know that typically I like end up adding the water and the other things, but I don't know why lately I've been seeing some clumping happening for me. So I'm just gonna do this the same way I would do a cake batter, where I'm gonna go ahead and add my sugar to it. So and my baking powder. So I have 3/4 of a cup of sugar. Now, if you're using the freeze dried strawberries and if you're using the kit that came with that almond milk, I typically use unsweetened almond milk. However, the milk that we received from our vendor was sweetened. It wasn't the unsweetened variety. So if you want to just go a little bit lighter on your sugar, you can absolutely do that so that you don't end up with an overly sweet. Again, yours freeze dried strawberries are already really ripe and sweet. You have a sweetened milk, so you can go a little bit lighter on your sugar. Maybe start with half a cup, and then maybe you can add like a tablespoon or two if you still feel like you need a little bit more of that sweetness. So this is a raw sugar. The crystals are fairly large. In the raw sugar, it's very low on the processing spectrum. I love using this particular type of sugar if I'm not using like maple syrup or dates or something like that. I'm also going to add my baking powder, and this is what's going to help my tamales get really fluffy and rise. And this is 1 tablespoon. So it's just going to help them in the steaming process to get nice and kind of cakey, right? So I'm going to just mix all that in to my masa harina with my whisk. Ooh, and the other thing I forgot to do is heat up my water, because we're going to add some water to this. We're going to add our 1 cup of hot water. And I have a hot water kettle where I'm just going to turn it on. I think the water should still be hot because I heated it up earlier. But I just want to make sure that it's like really boiling hot. And that essentially is what's going to activate the masa harina to start absorbing that. The heat is kind of what wakes it up from this dry process. So I have my coconut oil, my butter that I'll put on top, and I'm going to pour that hot water just over it, just to make sure it's like all really well incorporated and helps melt it down. So I'm just going to plop. Of course, if you melt this, your process will be even better. There we go. So I'm adding my 4 tablespoons of butter and my half a cup of coconut oil. If you want this to feel like it has more of a fatty texture, loosen it up a little bit, you can definitely get closer to the 1/4 cup. If you're using, if you don't have the vegan butter, you can definitely get it closer to the 3/4 of a cup of the refined coconut oil. And so now all I have left to add in are my liquids. I have my strawberry almond milk mixture on standby. I have my rose water on standby. But first of all, I want to hit this with that hot water. I can hear that it's almost done. And we're going to hit it with that 1 cup of hot water, and then immediately add the other liquids and mix, mix, mix. Try to, if you see any clumping that happens, I like to use a spatula. Actually, if you have a hand mixer or a stand mixer, which I don't have either at home, so I'm just going to use like, elbow grease. I'm just going to use muscle power to do it. But if you have either of those, your life will be definitely easier, because that's going to help whip it and get it all well incorporated really well. So definitely use that tool if it's available to you. I just have a hand blender with the whisk attachment. So it's the same thing as me whisking. And it doesn't really mix in the same way that hand mixer does, that has the kind of the 2, they're not whisks. I don't know what you would call them. They're not blades either. They're the 2 moving parts together. All right, so I have my hot water. I'm going to actually, let me grab I was using this to measure my coconut oil, so it's kind of funky, but it's gonna work. I have 1 cup here that I'm going to pour in. I'm gonna pour this just on top of my vegan butter and my coconut oil, help that all get mixed up and melt down. And then I'm going to Just make sure that's all kind of in there. And then let me go ahead and pour in. So I'm getting all my liquids in here. My strawberry almond milk mixture is all in there. And my rose will also go in there. And I'm going to start working here. So I'm just going to use my my spatula at first to just kind of scrape down the sides slightly. I'm going to use both tools. I'm going to make a little bit of a mess right here. I probably should have had a slightly bigger bowl right now. There we go. And then let me get my whisk in here and start getting this all incorporated. So I'll probably go a little back and forth here using those two tools. Right now, it's going to seem at first a little bit more loose of a mixture because the masa harina still hasn't absorbed the liquid yet. So it's going to get pretty loose, but then it's going to start to thicken up because the masa harina will start to absorb and it'll start to yield a thick batter. So you should have this like really faint, light shade of pink. My strawberries, like I said, weren't the most amazing strawberries I've ever used. So, you know, I could put in here if I wanted to, a little bit of, I actually have the, you know, the dehydrated strawberries as well, obviously. So I like to also keep my strawberries, like I have the whole strawberries, but then I also I blend it up in a dry blender and I just have like this powder available. And so sometimes I add that to a tea or to, you know, anything really that could call like atole, for example, that will be easy to incorporate into that particular dish in a powder form rather than like the whole strawberries. So I could add some of that to get the color a little bit more vibrant. I also do have beet powder. So however, beet powder and strawberry powder in the cooking process, sometimes they do turn slightly brown, you know, but I find that with this cooking process in the steaming versus baking in the oven, it stays a little bit more vibrant and red. So you can see what my masa harina is looking like here. And it'll continue to thicken up slightly as time goes by. And so I'm looking to see, like, do I have any big chunks in there of masa that are still clumping, and hasn't broken down into my masa preparada is what we would call it. In English, you would say more of like a masa batter. And if you do have any, you know, chunks in here, sometimes what I like to do, this bowl is kind of small, so it's not going to be the greatest, but sometimes what I like to do is I like to just use my spatula. And if I see any like little clumps, which this one actually looks pretty good, but if I did, I like to just kind of scrape. So notice how I'm just like using my spatula to scrape. And if I did have any little pieces of like balls of masa harina that haven't incorporated, the scraping kind of just breaks them down and helps get them mixed into the rest of the batter. So I'll like scrape the bottom. I'll check to see if I see any, but this is looking really great. Okay. So any questions about this process so far? Are folks here with me, whoever's cooking along, or are you still a few steps behind? All right. I think this looks good. So let me just show you. This is before class, I made the freeze-dried strawberry mixture. And then this is obviously the one we just made with the fresh strawberries. So this has been sitting out for, when did this class start? 10:30. This has been sitting out for at least like 40 to 60 minutes or so. So you can see that it's still slightly runny, like it's falling off my spatula, but it's definitely thicker because it's been exposed to air for a longer period of time. This one is obviously more smooth and creamy because it just got mixed in, but also notice there's like a very faint color difference. This one, I can see the pink a little bit more in it with the freeze dried. This one, not as much with the fresh strawberries, but it is likely because my strawberries were not the best, most sweet strawberries. So just to show you the slight difference, but I mean, it would be more of a side-by-side comparison if I had just made each of them. So this one's been out a little bit, so it looks just a little bit different. And this, I just made a half batch so that I can start cooking some tamales, which are on the stove, just to get a little bit of a head start so that when we're completed with our class, I can show you a finished tamal. Now, I'm gonna let my masa hang out for a second before I start stuffing them in the corn husks. What I do wanna show you is just how I prepare my pot. So if you are new to making tamales, let me just start this video here. And it's facing me, oh my goodness. Let me turn that around. All right, there we go. So let me grab a towel to open this hot pot. So for your tamales, you're definitely gonna want a nice big pot. And what you're also gonna want to do is add some sort of a strainer at the bottom. And so I only have water up to that strainer, not past it. And you need to be cautious to make sure that there's always water in there, because sometimes, like right now, I did have the lid on completely sealed. But if you have the lid on slightly ajar and some of that steam or that vapor is evaporating, then you're gonna lose some of the water that you have in there. It's not gonna be circulating. And so you just wanna check to make sure you have enough water. The way that I like to check is I just literally grab a pair of tongs, which I'm gonna just make a loud sound right now, dropping a couple things. Oh my gosh, these tongs are like, I'm coming with this other tool. There we go. So I'll grab my pair of tongs and I'll just lift the side and check, and you can see there. Ooh, and that steam is hot, it'll burn you. So just checking, okay, that has enough water. If it didn't, what will happen is you'll start to burn the tamales because they're just gonna scorch versus steam. And then sometimes that smoky, because it'll start to smoke in there, that smokiness will penetrate into the tamales and they'll taste burnt. So you need to be cautious of the water amount that you have in there. And so I tied my tamales, which I'll show you that process in a second. The reason I tied them is mostly because there's only 3 in this pot. If it were a whole pot stuffed with tamales, they kind of all, because they're so close up to each other, they kind of help hold each other tightly so that they don't start to fall apart. But because there's only 3 and the steam and so on and so forth, I like to tie them for the smaller batches just to make sure that they stay nice and tight. Now, this pot is just a regular stainless steel pot, and this tool, the steamer basket, is a separate tool. So I'm just utilizing my already existing pot with my separate tool that I'm just using. And people use these steamer baskets to like steam vegetables or whatever, but I'm using it here to steam tamales. And so I just recommend a nice tall enough pot. Like I have another enamel pot that I use for other things, but it's probably about like only like this tall, you know, like somewhere around here. And so as you can see, my tamales are like all the way up to the brim of the pot. And so if you have a shorter one, your tamales are going to pop out. You can't put the lid on, and so steam is about as is coming out of the pot as you're cooking. So you have to keep a closer eye on your water levels. So just wanted to show you how I prep it. So if you are cooking along or just getting ready for your tamales later, just find a good sized pot, put in a steamer. If you don't have a steamer basket, I've done other, like I've seen people do other makeshift things. Like I've seen people do foil, like they'll get foil, they'll make balls of foil, and they'll put all the balls of foil like along the bottom of the pot, and then they'll put another layer of foil over and like poke holes in it. And so that kind of helps to create a version of like that, right? And then you add the water, and essentially all you're trying to do is get the tamales to steam without touching the water, so that they don't boil, they steam. So you just have to create that barrier. So I am going to go ahead and let those keep cooking. I have the pot on at like a medium low, So it's in between medium and low, just because I'm not keeping an eye on it as much because I'm cooking. So, but like usually medium, low tends to be okay. A little bit closer to medium is good. And these tamales are gonna cook for anywhere between like 45 minutes to an hour or so. And we'll talk more about that as we get our tamales going. So let's head back to the countertop.
And
All right.
Jocelyn,
Yeah.
where would you recommend buying your pots, or what brand is that? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, this particular brand, it's a brand called Tramontina. It's Italian actually. So I think it's Italian. The brand is called Tramontina. And the reason I like this particular pot, I think you can see it there, is because I like the fact that the lid is glass so I can see what's going on inside. And then the other thing that I really like is if you're making pasta, it has this like strainer attachment that you put on the top of the pot so that when you drain your pasta, it automatically does it with just this tool rather than having to have a whole colander in your sink. So, I mean, I think it's a multifunctional pot. And of course, it works well with my tamales and so on and so forth. It's a nice big size pot. So that's the brand. You can find it online. You can find it directly through their website or through other vendors. Okay, so let's get into the tamal husks and start stuffing some of these tamales. And we can get those going in the pot. And then we'll do a bonus cashew cream at the end. So we're getting close. All right, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna be over here at my sink for a second because I'm just going to drain all the liquid out of these corn husks. And then I'm also gonna give them a nice good rinse in some warm water, warm to hot water. Again, especially if you can sense like any like scent or potential flavor coming from the husk that isn't just corn, like it might be whatever they preserve it in to get them to stay nice and dry without spoiling. So sometimes they have that kind of like weird tart smell or like acidic smell. So I like to just give them a good rinse, especially when, you know, when they do have that little bit of extra acidity to them. Okay. And so once we drain all that liquid out, if you still feel like they're really wet, you can always squeeze them over your sink to try to get even more of that liquid out. And essentially they should be really nice and soft and pliable now. They should have been soaking. If you started soaking them last night, you know, that's totally fine. They could have just been in room temperature water. But if you started soaking them this morning, you want to, or just today generally, you want to give them at least like 30 minutes in a hot water because that's going to make it work a whole lot faster, right? Okay. So let me just get some of these things out of the way. All right. So we have our corn husks. Oh, and the thing I forgot to add to my masa harina is a little pinch of salt. So I like to add a little pinch of salt in there. It's in the recipe itself, but I forgot to throw it in there. I'm just gonna mix that in. It's literally just, I'm using kosher salt. Usually a pinch is these 3 fingers and your thumb. Leave your pinky out, grab whatever you can, and that's a pinch. So just something to kind of have the flavors come out of the, you know, the sweetness to kind of counterbalance it. I love adding salt to everything, including sweets. And so I think it's just a nice little note in there. So for the corn husks, I'm just gonna work directly on my countertop. And I'm gonna talk about the different types of corn husks that you're gonna have in your batch there. So first things first, especially if you haven't made tamales before, they should be moist, but if they're soaking wet and dripping all over the place, just use your like a dish towel or a nice sturdy paper towel to just pat them dry so that they're not dripping all over the place. And then notice that the corn husk has like a natural curve where the corn was, right? And so you want to put your masa harina inside of that curve versus trying to flip it over to the other side against the natural way that the corn wants to roll. So definitely important there. And then I like corn husks that, let me show you like my favorite ones and then show you the ones that I'm not always a fan of. So for example, this one here, this one's pretty great. So the reason I think this one's pretty great is because it has these really nice, it has like this nice grain to it. It has this, obviously all of them do. So like whatever the hoja ends up looking like, or the corn husk, that's what your tamal is gonna look like. So I like when it's nice and smooth, and also when it's nice and wide like this one, because then it means like just with one leaf alone is gonna be just enough. And so this would be like a perfect little tamal. Whereas if I had, I can even look at this one. So this one, for example, notice that it has all these like ripples and ridges at the bottom. So because it has all these shapes on it, my tamal is gonna have that shape too. And I don't really like the way that that ends up looking on the final product. So this isn't like my most ideal tamal. However, I will still use it for a couple reasons, or if I'm in a pinch and I need to use it, I will. It's not a big deal. And we're also gonna cover these with, you know, if you're making the cream, if you're using the rose petals, like you will be able to kind of cover up any imperfections on the tamal itself. But you could use this with a secondary hoja. Like if this one was maybe not as wide as it is, like you could find another one that has a more smooth shape to it that isn't as wide as you need it to be to get your tamal in the, you know, completely covered. And you can place that inside. So you can kind of, in Spanish you say empalmarlos. In English you would say, I guess, like stack them on each other. And usually I put this more narrow hoja on the inside of the one that's a little bit wider. And I'll put it a little over to the right. And then what I'll do is I'll end up focusing the masa here in this section. So this will be like the top of my tamal, what, you know, whatever's touching this hoja. And then when I roll it, I'll try to keep it as much in that first hoja as possible, but it's still gonna touch a little bit of the one with the ripples, and that one will be on the outside, if that makes sense. So just me trying to create that nice texture that I want in the shape of the tamal, right? So that's one thing, and then stacking them. And of course, if you have any that are like really funky and like this one, for example, it's like, it's kind of thin, it has the ripples, it has some holes in it. What you could use this one for is you could just tear it, and it easily tears it on the grains to create the strips if you want to tie your tamales. So I mentioned tying them, like I tied the ones that I have inside of the pot right now, mostly because, like I said, it's a big old pot and it's just like 3 lonely little tamales. And so what will happen is, like, if I start cooking the tamales and I don't have it tied, what will happen is, like, as the masa inside the tamal husk starts to expand and move, and there's like no other tamales around it to kind of like press on the all around it, it'll start to kind of ooze and sag and like kind of do this inside the pot. So that's why I tied the ones that are in there. But if you have like at least a dozen, which is typically what this this amount of masa harina will yield, then you should be able to have a full pot. Tying them is not super essential, but if you like that element, then by all means, you can definitely do it. So let me show you what a few of them look like. Let me get rid of this whisk. And I'm going to just mix in my salt that I put on top. Now notice how this is thickened up, right? So it looks a lot thicker than just a few moments ago when we were had just finished making it. So it's still, you know, it's still soft, but it's definitely a little bit thicker than it was maybe just 10 minutes ago. So I like to use a scoop. So this is a food grade scoop that I use for cooking. It looks just like an ice cream scoop, but it's specifically meant for food because it's you can get different sizes. So this one's 2 ounces. I have a, you know, like a 1 ouncer here that I use like when I bake cookies or something. It's a smaller size. You can get them in like 3 ounce, 4 ounce, so on and so forth, depending on like whatever it is that you're making. And so I typically like to use anywhere between 2 to 3 ounces of masa per tamal. And so because this is a 2 ounce scoop, essentially what I'll do is a scoop and a half. So I'll start with, you know, kind of scraping the masa against the bowl so I get a flat top of the scoop. You don't have to scoop. If you just want to use spoons, you can, and kind of eyeball it. It's not a big deal, but for food service, like when you want consistency, this is what we use to make sure we're always using the same amount each time. So you just want to scoop. You don't need to spread it. This is different than savory tamales. Savory tamales, you spread them because you're going to stuff something inside. These, because they're not getting stuffed, don't need to get spread out. I'm going to grab another half scoop, put that on top. So that's 3 ounces, right? And then I'm going to start with the right side. Right, it's my right. I'm just going to fold that over. And then I only fold it up to like where I can kind of like just up to like where the masa's at. So it's kind of getting like tucked in. And then I try to gently but kind of tightly wrap the tamal until it's closed. And then wherever the opening is of the tamal, so here is like where it opens, this is now the back of my tamal. I'm going to grab my fingers, my index and my thumb, and slightly pinch up, and I'm going to fold the bottom up towards the back. And so here is my little tamal, right? And so option for you to just keep it this way, and sometimes you can like kind of squeeze and kind of spread out your masa accordingly. And again, wherever you end up kind of leaving the shape, that's what your tamal is going to look like. So it's going to be, this one is going to be like a little bit more narrow at the bottom, a little bit more wide at the top. You can adjust it if you need to. And then if you wanted to, you can use the little ties, and you can tie the bottom if you want. You can just use one of these and literally just tie it. Sometimes they'll rip if they're super fragile. And then if you wanted to tie the top, you could tie the top as well. Now, I like to still fold the bottom before tying. Let me get this top a little bit tighter here. Reason being is that my tamal pot is only so tall. So sometimes, let me show you another example of like how people might tie a tamal and why that doesn't work for me, just because of the height of my pot. But if you have a really tall pot, you can absolutely do this other method. So I just don't personally prefer it, but some people really like the way that they look this way. So I'm going to stack 2 leaves on each other, 2 hojas. Let me get my 1 scoop. This is 2 ounces. This is also, again, not a big deal. You don't have to get exactly 3 ounces, but you can kind of see here how much masa I end up with. I would say that it's about, what, 2.5 ounces is about like a little bit more than a quarter cup, like a third of a cup or so. And then I'm gonna fold over, starting with the right side, kind of tuck it in. See how I'm still on that top hoja. So like this one is the one that has like little ridges on it. And I'm trying to get the shape of the tamal, the, you know, final cooked product, to have only this shape of the, or only this texture, I should say, of the hoja that's inside, but the other one's kind of what's helping to tuck it all in. So what some people do is they do this. And actually I should have put my masa like a little bit further towards the center, but what some people will do is they'll tie this side, which is right now the top. And they'll do that. And then they'll tie this side. They won't fold over, they'll just tie it. And then that is their tamal. And so you have to make sure that you tie the bottom tight enough, because obviously you don't want the masa to be able to ooze out. And so some people like the look of this on a plate as presentation, but when you're standing it in the pot, I mean, this you would really have to try to like stack them laying down more than like standing. And so what you would have to do is kind of like stack them like this on each other and then like keep going like this around the pot. So you're kind of creating like a little puzzle, you know, over each other until you get to the top to be able to steam them all without anything like oozing out of the top and the bottom. So that's just another way. And then again, if you are just, my family, when we would make sweet tamales, we did not do the little knots and all that. So we just made a big old pot of tamales. This is like the perfect hoja right here. Look at how big this one is. This one would be perfect if I were making a savory tamal where I have to spread the masa out. Look at how wide that is. And it's like the perfect texture. This is like an A+ one. I'd be like so happy to work with this one right here for a savory. I just feel like it's not super necessary to be this wide for a sweet one because it's going to, you don't need to spread it out. So I'm going to just open up this hoja, add my masa in, and then I'm going to, if you have too much hoja like this one, what I like to do is instead of, sometimes people will like fold, let's see if I can show you properly, like they'll fold this kind of like into the masa and it gets kind of, or sometimes they'll do this and then fold it over and some of this masa ends up like on the outside of this hoja. I don't personally prefer that because when you're when you're opening or unwrapping it, you end up with like cooked masa out here and it separates from like the rest of the main tamal. And so sometimes people just throw that away, you know, like they just take the wrapping off of the tamal or the husk and they'll just throw it away. And it's like perfectly good masa. So I like to try to keep it all inside. And so in this situation, I would bring this hoja over and like kind of tuck the part that is extra out and then roll. So the masa still all together. It's all together. And then again, wherever the opening is, this is the back. I'm going to use my fingers to pinch up on the bottom and fold up towards the back. And this is my tamal. And so we would just put them in here like into the pot this way, just like this. And so when you're doing this, let me go back to the other camera right now. Let me uncover my pot. So let's see here. So whenever you're putting the tamales in the pot, wherever the back was, right? So wherever your openings and your where you're folding up on the bottom, that needs to go face the side of the pot, if that makes sense. So if you were to have it turned the opposite way where that fold is facing me and the opening is facing me, then that little flap is gonna like fold down because it's gonna relax and it's gonna fold down. And then you can start to see like some oozing might happen with the tamal. And so what you wanna do is you want to, you know, stack all, you know, here's the opening, right? I'm gonna turn that towards the back of my pot. And you want to just go all around the perimeter of your pot, get them packed nice and tightly. Like these are hot already, so I'll use some tongs to move those. And so you want to pack them nice and tight, close to each other. And then once you have that perimeter done, you want to create like an inner ring just inside of those. If you can get a few more in the middle, go ahead and do that. And then any other leftover ones that you have at the end after that, you can just lay them on top. So you should have a nice packed pot if possible. And if you do have that, then you can leave them this way untied if you'd like. So it's kind of up to you, whatever your final presentation is going to be like as well. And then you want to try to set the lid on completely or just slightly ajar. And if you have a glass lid like I do, you'll be able to see the water in there, the vapor that will let you know that there's definitely still water in there and that it's steaming. Once it looks all white and cloudy like smoke, then you have no more liquid in there and you need to get more liquid in there ASAP. So you can go ahead and let those keep cooking. And let me go back here. Sorry, I'm walking away with my phone on. All right, and then before I plate that, I just want to do the little bonus round of the sweet cashew cream, just the topping on top of the tamales, just to give it a little extra something something. Again, sweet tamales typically are just served as is. Like typically the only thing that you'll find in there is like if you have like tamales de piña or tamales de elote, which are pineapple or sweet corn based. Like you might have like little chunks of pineapple or little chunks of corn that are like little treats throughout the tamal, but they typically are not stuffed with anything or topped with anything. So you just eat them as is. Um, but this sweet cream is like, why not have a little something something? You have the cashews. So I
And
have here,
Jocelyn,
yeah, go
before
ahead.
we get into the cashews, can you let us know what the purpose of tying the tamales would be? And also, we have a comment from Evie saying that my grandma used to make her tamales tied like that without the fold and with the two ties at the top and bottom.
Yeah, yeah, that's a lot of work. That's like a huge amount of work, especially if it's just you on your own making them. Imagine tying every single tamal. And so yeah, you can like leave them kind of open how I had them, like a candy wrapper almost, or you can even like some people will kind of loop like they would loop this like that and then tie it, you know? So it's a lot of work. It's definitely a lot of work. Be patient with it. The purpose of tying them, like I mentioned earlier, is just especially if you feel like your tamales might start to like move out of place, like if you're making a half batch and you don't have a full batch of tamales, um, they can ooze as they're cooking, as they're activated by the steam and the heat. They can kind of ooze down and things will shift, and you'll have tamales that don't end up looking like a tamal shape, like in this photograph. You might end up with something that's like very thick at the top and like very narrow at the bottom, or like a little ball because everything just kind of oozed down because there was nothing that was like holding it in its shape. So the ties just kind of help to hold it in its shape. But for me, it's like mostly if my pot isn't already full of tamales, where like they can't move because there's all these tamales all around them, in front of them, beside them, and so they're kind of stuck in that shape, right? But if there's like nothing around them, then they can kind of like relax and ooze and end up looking like a slightly different shape than maybe what you anticipated. Trust me, there's like plenty of these classes where like I've made just like 2 or 3 tamales to show you at the end, and I didn't put anything else around them, and they always get a little like saggy. So there's usually like one that came out good and the other 1 or 2 look like not tamales, they just look all off. So tying them in that particular situation just helps a whole lot. Okay, so the cream. So I have 1 cup of cashews. I soaked them in hot water just because I wanted them to get really nice and soft. And I started soaking them like just a little bit before class. So I like using raw cashew pieces, raw, because when they're toasted, you can taste a little bit of this toasty flavor, and that I don't want, right? Because I don't want that. I just want to use these cashews essentially for a creamy texture. Raw cashews are really neutral in flavor, but when they start to get like salted and toasted and like all these other kind of flavors in the cashews, then it starts to taste like cashews. But actually, I'm trying to get you to not even notice that there's cashews in it. So raw cashews are best. Um, Soak them for at least a couple hours or overnight if you want. If you have a high power blender like I do, you can soak them for like 30 minutes in hot liquid, and that should do the trick because your high power blender is definitely going to blend them till smooth. And the other reason I like to use pieces versus whole fancy cashews is because I rarely end up keeping the whole cashew together. I typically end up blending it or pulsing it in a food processor. So no need to spend extra money on whole cashews when the pieces are typically cheaper, and you're gonna not see that they were ever cashews to begin with. So you can definitely get pieces. Now I'm going to drain all this liquid out. I don't want any of the soaking liquid. I have fresh liquid that I'm going to blend them in. So this is 1 cup of cashews just soaked in enough water to cover them. And they actually started to pop out from the top because they absorbed water, and the top of the top layer started to touch air without being submerged in water. I have a half cup of just regular water, like drinking water, whatever you'd like to use. that once these are drained, I'm gonna blend them in this half cup of water. Now keep in mind that the cashews also have water inside now because they've been soaking for a long period of time. And then if you have the kit and you want to stick to the same sugar that you already have in the kit, I have here 3 tablespoons, but use between 2 to 3. See how you like the sweetness. And if you know, want it to be nice and sweet, you can definitely use the 3 tablespoons. If you want it to be even sweeter, by all means, you can definitely add a little bit more if you'd like. Alternatively, if you have like a pure maple syrup, you can use about like 1 to 2 tablespoons. It'll be really nice. Like a soaked date, like if you have dates on hand, a medjool, like 1 soaked medjool date would be really nice. But again, if you just want to use the sugar that you already used for the tamal recipe, you can definitely use that same sugar, 2 to 3 tablespoons, 1 cup of cashews, half a cup of water. You'll end up with a really nice creamy, like I guess a sweet cream is what I'm trying to say, right? So let me go ahead and just drain this liquid out. Just get all of that liquid out. I'm gonna grab another blender cup here, or I'm actually gonna just give this one a little rinse because it's the same, it's just that strawberry milk mixture. Just gonna give this a little rinse. And if you wanted to kind of keep that rose element in line, I mean, you could also potentially add like a little bit of rose water into it, but I would go really light on it, like maybe like a 1/4 teaspoon up to like a 1/2 teaspoon if you wanted to add that little bit of rose element. So I have my 1 cup of cashews going in. You can see they're nice and moist. They should be a little bit pliable because they've been soaking in that liquid, in that water. And then I have my 1/2 cup of water that's going in. And then I'll start with about 2 tablespoons. I'll taste and then I'll see if I want to add the third one. There we go. So I still have about a tablespoon in there. And then you're just going to blend, and I'll show you the consistency. You may need more water, and that's totally okay. Just to slightly loosen it, you can keep adding touches of water. If you feel like it's not smooth and creamy, it's still staying a little bit chunky. This could be more true, especially if you don't have a high power blender. If you're using like just a regular home blender and your blender is struggling to get it nice and creamy, hit it with a little bit more water to help it help your blender kind of blend it along. The other thing I will say that cashew creams typically thicken over time. So you might make it and it might feel like it's a little bit too runny, like it's thick and creamy, but like a little bit watery. If you just let that sit in the fridge or just sit out even on the counter for, you know, half an hour, it's gonna start to thicken up a little bit because these cashews are like still slightly absorbing liquid, especially if you didn't soak them overnight, right? So I'm just gonna come to my blender and blend these until they're nice and smooth. So let me show you what this is looking like. So we'll look at the consistency, and then if you want to sweeten it more, you can. So look at that nice cream texture. It's something you can run a line through. It's nice and creamy and smooth. Hopefully I don't drip on my computer. I'm gonna give it a taste. I'm gonna go ahead and add that last tablespoon of sugar. It's sweet, but it could be nice and sweeter. And then for flavoring, like I said, you could add that little dash of rose water if you want to play with that rose element. You could add a little bit of vanilla if you wanted to and make it more of a vanilla base. I mean, you could take it in really any direction that you wanted to, just to give it that another note of flavor in your dish. So let me just blend in. All right. So here we have our cashew cream, nice and smooth. Let me give it another little taste. Yeah, and that's perfect. That 3 tablespoons for me is like, did the trick. Of course, if you add pure maple syrup, it's gonna have a little bit of that like maple syrup flavor in the back note, which is totally fine. Maple syrup is delicious. That's why everybody loves it, right? So this is what your cream should look like. If you look inside of my blender, you can see that it's, let me pan down a little bit more. You can see that it's slightly runny, you know? So it's smooth but runny, but it'll thicken even more as I let it hang out for a little bit. And so I don't need it to get a whole lot thicker. Like I'm not looking for like a dollop of whipped cream. This is more of like a smooth cream that'll be slightly runny. So I'll plate a tamal right now. This is gonna kind of like ooze off the sides. I'll top it with some dried rose petals. You can absolutely top it with, if you have the fresh strawberries, just any fresh strawberries that you already have on hand and you want to top them with fresh strawberries, you can do that as well. So let me get a plate. And let's plate up our final dish here. So yeah, I'll use this plate. Let me grab my towel. Any questions as I'm getting all this, the last plating together here? So I'm just gonna grab some tongs and get one of my tamales out of the pot here that we're cooking earlier, or that was cooking earlier. Okay. So let me show you what this one's looking like. This one's been cooking for our entire class. I literally put in the tamal just as class was starting. So I'm just gonna remove the little ties and then I'm gonna flip it over. So these are where all the openings are. And it should come out as one pretty solid tamal here because I made sure to wrap it. So see, I just had a little piece here that came off, but totally fine. But it's not like all this masa that I'm gonna end up throwing away, right? So you could serve it on the husk if you wanted to, or you could serve it directly on the plate. I actually think that serving it on the husk is a nice little presentation. So I'm gonna do that. Let me gently, because this is gonna be really soft. I hope I don't break it. I might break it. I should have left it on there. Here we go. Whew. All right. Because especially when they come right out of the pot, they're really fragile. What I typically like to do is like I'll cook them, like I mentioned, for like 45 an hour. And then I like to just turn off the heat. Like, so you can test one. The way you know that they're done is, as you can see, like when I unwrapped it, the masa was like not sticking at all to the hoja. It's kind of a standalone kind of thing now. Like tamal is its own thing. It's not depending on the hoja anymore, and it stands up. Obviously you can see it holds its shape. That's when you know it's really done, right? And then I'm going to top it with, let me grab a nice big spoon here. I'm going to top it with a couple nice spoonfuls of my cashew cream. I'll kind of pour it over the top center here, kind of like at a diagonal. Let me add a little bit more. So as you can see, the cream is not like a whipped cream. It's definitely going to, it's going to pour over versus a dollop. And then I have my little rose petals here that you can just do over that little ribbon of the cream, or you can kind of do all over, but they're mostly going to stick to the cream itself. So this is our final tamal dish. Now let me grab a fork. Actually, I'll grab a little spoon and give it a taste. Any questions as I'm giving this a little taste, and you can see that up close too, right? So doesn't that look beautiful, y'all? Right? And then if you had some fresh strawberries in there, that way whoever's eating it, they know it's strawberries, it's obviously roses. And you can get a little piece that has the cream, a little bit of rose petals, and then of course a nice bit of tamal. It's gonna be really hot, so give me 1 second. So I think I might have not finished the thought, but what I was saying was once the 45-hour is done, and I know that the tamal is complete, it's, I take one out, maybe I test to check that it's completely done, but typically like by an hour or so, it's done because it's been cooking for that long as there's been like water consistently in there. And then I turn off the pot and I just let them hang out in the pot for like another 20 minutes, like just with the heat off, but it's still really hot inside the pot. And I find that that extra, like 20 minutes of just kind of sitting in there with the heat off, and like it doesn't chill them. Obviously, you still take them out 20 minutes later, they're still going to be super steamy and hot, but it's not as hot as it was 20 minutes prior. And so I find that that 20 minutes lets them kind of set a little bit more, especially when you have like stuffed tamales, like the savory stuffed ones. It just kind of helps them set. And it helps you to be able to kind of take them out a little bit more easier than and not feel like they're going to fall apart on you. So let me try giving this a bite now. It's super luscious. The coconut oil is essential in giving it that little the soft texture of the tamal. You can see that the inside here looks nice and fluffy. The cream is just like a cherry on top, for lack of a better term. And you get a little bit of that hint of the rose in there. It's like not overpowering at all. I think people might not realize it right away. Like it's not going to punch them in the face and be like, "You're eating rose." They're going to be like, "Wow, these are really great. Like, what's in that? What is that taste?" And it's the rose. So that's why the roses on top are also a nice touch to let the person know you're going to eat something that has a floral element to it. You always want to be really careful with your florals, because I use a lot of rose water, lavender, orange blossom, and it's a fine line you have to walk of like making sure it feels seen, but also making sure it doesn't overpower. So you got to play around with that. But any other questions as we finish out our class?
Yeah, can you let us know where you buy your edible rose petals?
Mm-hmm. Mm. I took a bite right. Edible rose petals. You can pick them up typically at your local Indian grocery store. So if there's an Indian shop near you, you can typically find them there. Obviously online, there's just make sure you type in like edible dried rose petals, because not all rose petals are meant to be eaten. Some of them, a lot of roses are you mean that you have to kind of use a high amount of pesticides to keep away insects. And so those are more like the roses that we grow in our yards or that you give to somebody like on a day like Valentine's Day. Those typically see a high amount of pesticides to make sure that they yield like a beautiful visual flower. Whereas like these rose petals, they end up being like little bits and things. And they're typically actually much smaller little roses, like little rosebuds. But yes, typically Asian grocery stores. If you follow, I have a friend who owns a spice trade company. It's called Diaspora Co. And she just sent me a huge pouch, like huge, I have it tucked away, but it's like a huge pouch of rose petals that I haven't started to work with yet, but she's testing them out because she's going to start selling them. And her rose petals, let me tell you, are probably going to be like the best quality out there. So check out Diaspora Co. if you want to keep an eye out for when she releases those. Any other questions?